We could not be more pleased to present a fascinating conversation between two luminaries, Will Shortz, puzzle editor of the New York Times, founder and director of the American Crossword Puzzle Tournament, and puzzle master for NPR's Weekend Edition Sunday. And Garry Trudeau, Pulitzer Prize-winning creator of an American treasure, the comic strip Doonesbury.
Their engaging repartee about working in college newspapers, not knowing it would lead to fulfilling careers, the origins of creativity and imagination, play as a precursor to work, collecting words and more, provide an entertaining and captivating exchange.
Both talents foster and fuel their imaginations with continued creative endeavours, including for Will, the launch of Will Shortz Games, a series of games, books and calendars which will debut from Andrews McMeel in the coming weeks, including the game Down and Across, Championship Crosswords, and Brain Twisters 2022 Day-to-Day Calendar.
For Garry, his weekly installment of the iconic, irreverent, incomparable Doonesbury, which has readers entertained and informed for more than 50 years. The recent publication of Doonesbury at 50, The Complete Doonesbury, celebrated the first 5 decades of the comic strip. And now to Will and Garry.
Doonesbury couldn't fit on the usual comics page because the requirement was that it was larger because you had more detailed art. So it required.
Well, that wasn't from the beginning. That was when I came back from a sabbatical working in the theater, and in the interim, the newspapers had standardized across the country to a smaller size. And so when we came back, when the strip was re-syndicated in 1984, we came back with the proviso that it remained the same size that it had always been.
Gotcha.
And a lot of editors felt that was me telling them how to do their job. And there was a lot of pushback. And we said, no, we're just selling you a product that comes in a certain size. You can buy it or not buy it. And over time, they most newspapers came around.
Yeah.
You know, if you can't use what tiny leverage you have, what's the point to maintain a certain standard? So, I had a trial by fire. I had to go out and quell the mutiny at an editors convention, and I took all their letters that they'd written me, all their angry letters, and tried to
put them in a bonfire.
Yeah, and took it head on. And I think I got some credit for that, just for facing the beast.
Yeah, nice going. And you were just a kid then, a veritable kid.
I was 34 then.
You're okay, 34, that old. Okay. Well, as you know, this is for people at play. So I have some questions I'd like to ask you. But the first one is, I know when you entered Yale, you were enrolled as an art major. When did you first see yourself as a professional cartoonist?
Well, when I became one, I wasn't seeing myself as much of anything through those 4 years because I was classified. I passed the draft physical, and I knew I'd be drafted as soon as. So it was hard to imagine yourself as anything with that hanging over you. I was in fact recruited in my junior year after doing a grand total of 6 strips for the college paper, and I was spotted by a new syndicate. And so I, with the thought that maybe it might amount to something down the road, I continued doing it. And so I had a year and a half of practice in the farm system and, working for a college newspaper. And then I didn't get drafted. And so I began in October following graduation. It was a very short dues paying period. It's not a story my kids much care for, because they have been lectured their entire life about preparing yourself for that kind of serendipity, preparing yourself for good luck so that you're ready when if and when it presents itself.
Right.
And I didn't seem to have had the same kind of struggles that all of them would invariably have as they made their way into their various lives and careers.
Yeah. I made puzzles for my student newspaper at Indiana University.
Did you?
A natural thing to do. Yeah. Once every week.
So,
not daily.
But surely you weren't imagining that there could possibly be a career in that.
I
right?
I did when in my 10th grade in high school, when asked to write a paper on 8th grade, when asked to write a paper on what I wanted to do with my life, it was to be a professional puzzle maker. Can you imagine? And there's basically no such thing, you know?
Yeah. Well, you know, you had your sights set in the right direction. When I was a kid, when I was about 7 or 8, I started a little theater group. And so I thought of myself as an impresario. I didn't know that word when I was 7, but I knew I knew the ramifications of it. I meant I had to take total responsibility for something. So I made the costumes, I put up the curtains, I installed the lights, I created the world's most dangerous lighting board. I wrote really bad plays, really bad music, but somehow got my neighborhood organized enough to put on these plays for about, I don't know, almost 10 years. So that, when you think about it, it's a kind of preparation for what I ended up doing. With a comic strip, you are an impresario. You control all those elements, so it was a kind of rehearsal. You know, much of play is rehearsal. You're running simulations, aren't you? And you know, that's not just true for our species. It's true throughout the animal kingdom. is that play is a precursor to work. It prepares you for work. It prepares you for things that enable you to survive by developing certain skills. So my childhood was all about that. It was about imagining later. And there's a wonderful novelist named Ian McEwan, a British novelist who I'm a big fan of. And he wrote a novel called On Chelsea Beach. And it's about a couple, it was a novella, and it was about a couple on the cusp of marriage, and then they get married, and this is about their honeymoon, which was a disaster. But in that book, which takes place in a very specific time, 1962, McEwan describes this marriage as a separation, a demarcation point between being a child and being an adult. That once you're married, there's no denying you're an adult. And that this came to a certain generation, such as mine, as an enormous relief, because childhood was considered unserious in a certain way. You wanted to get to all that stuff that was described in Mad Men, you know, all the drinking and the sex and all those things that were part of the adult world. You wanted to get to. So McEwan, I think, brilliantly describes that period in our social history as the last moment when before youth became the dominant cultural force, that we just want to stay young, that anything that we value is associated with being young. That up until then, you couldn't wait to get to be an adult. And so my childhood was just filled with all these simulations. I was trying on all these different hats and business models. And, you know, I ran a newspaper and a little community carnival, and I opened a clay mine, yes, and sold shares. You know, just ridiculous stuff, but all of them were imaginings of what my life might become. But it still had the characteristics of play. It was still fun.
Yeah.
You know, I was still using my imagination in these wild ways that but childhood makes it safe, right? And that's what's so great about college, by the way, is you could imagine yourself as a constructor of crossword puzzles because you had a place to do that. And, you know, you could have also decided, well, wait a minute, I only had 3 puzzles in me. You know, the way I could well have decided I only had 6 strips in me. But college is a safe place to try and fail, and to play and to immerse yourself, because the stakes are so low. They're just so low.
That's true.
And then once you get out of college, it's for real. And but you know, I was probably the last generation that couldn't wait to get to adulthood.
Don't you still think of yourself partly as a child now?
No,
I know I do, and you don't. Just
no.
Well, you certainly have imagination. That is a childlike attribute. And
I think we're both playful, right?
Yes.
I mean, but that's different, right, than imagining yourself as a child.
Okay.
I do think
Okay.
I imagine myself as 10 years ago, right? I mean, that's common, right?
Yeah,
You
yeah.
can't possibly be as, I'm 73, so let's get it on the table.
Okay, I'm 69.
So,
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you what your favorite game or toy was as a child, but it seems you were so imaginative, you were making everything up yourself. Did you have a favorite game?
yes, you know, I loved the standards, you know, Scrabble and mostly Monopoly. We played a lot of Monopoly, and the game of life. You understand? Did you hear that the inventor of the game of life left this life just recently?
Yeah.
I mean, can you imagine what all the opening sentence was and all the obits? The man who invented life has died.
Yeah.
For some reason, I love moving those little pegs into the cars and moving forward. But the favorite toys probably came from the realm of the Western, because half of what I saw on television were Westerns. I mean, forget that now, but most of the primetime dramas were Westerns, or a good many of them. And so I was outfitted with Fanner 50s. And I grew up in a small town where everybody hunted and everybody had guns. And my grandfather must have had 20 firearms in the house. I grew up in a culture where you got your first 22 when you were about 8. You got your first shotgun when you were about 12, and deer rifle when you were 16. And there was no fooling around, you know. And the NRA in those days was reinforced that they were all about safety. That's all they did.
Yeah,
was sportsmanship and safety. And you know, I have all the NRA models for excellence in the prone position. Still have them. Because of that, my father would never let me have a BB gun because he thought they were too gun-like, but I would treat it as a toy.
Huh.
So even though I was roaming the woods with a 22, I couldn't have a BB gun. But just prior to that, I had a Fanner 50 with shooting shells and greenie stickum caps. And my favorite of these, you know, these Western toys was something called the Bat Masterson Derringer belt buckle. Are you familiar with this?
I know Bat Masterson. I don't remember the belt buckle.
It was a big fancy belt buckle that had a Derringer embedded in it. So you're sitting down, all you have to do is push your belly out, and the Derringer would swing out and shoot the varmint across the card table from you without having to move your hands.
You don't have to move your hands.
Don't even have to move your hands. So he was a goner. Well, this toy has made several lists as one of the most dangerous toys ever invented, because it could, and in fact did, go
accidentally,
you know, within centimeters from the wearer's private parts. And so it was taken off the market, but fortunately not before both my sister and I were armed with these things.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was, I mean, I also had Lionel trains. I had trains going around and built endless models. Love building models. I built a fleet of airplanes, and then I linked them up with fishing line to my door so that when my parents came in, the planes would all go up in
That's great. Oh man, hearing all these things you play, they bring back a lot of memories of me of what I did. My favorite game show.
Oh, go ahead.
My favorite TV game show, of course, was Jeopardy. This was in the 1960s during Art Fleming's time, and they had a competition in 1964, if I remember right, where viewers could send in their own Jeopardy boards. You would prepare your board as you would like it to be presented on the show. And me, being a puzzle and quiz guy, I made up what I thought were some terrific questions, and the winners would get to appear, would come to New York City, attend the World's Fair, and have their board appear on the show. And I was crestfallen that mine was not chosen.
Oh, I thought you were going to tell me this great story about
Yeah. Well, I was 12.
New York.
Looking back at 12 years old, I can just imagine how good my board was.
Have you saved all of your your first attempts at puzzling? And I mean, are you an archivist? Do you keep all of this evidence of your journey?
I do. I'm a collector. I collect old books. I have over 25,000 puzzle books and magazines going back to 1533. And of course, I save all my own stuff too. Let's talk a little about Doonesbury. When you're working on it, how do you get into it? How do you get into a creative mindset?
Well, I never found a particular way of working because I was thrown into big time cartooning so early, and I had no good habits of mind. And so I was just constantly winging it, constantly. What the thing I was finding out about myself, had to find out about myself early on, was whether I was temperamentally built to meet a deadline week after week. I mean, a comic strip's like a public utility.
Yeah.
At least in those days it was. It was 365 days a year. And, you just had to meet that deadline. So the first thing was to figure out a way to survive that. Because I had no experience with it. When I did them for the college paper, it was just kind of when I could find some time. And so, it's a good thing I didn't meet my wife and have a family early on, because I had to figure out some way to kind of create a life for myself that allowed me to make these deadlines. And unfortunately, one of the first things to go is any perfectionism, if you had it. I didn't. I suspect you might, but I found, that's a luxury you don't have. That the bar is necessarily set at good enough. I have a friend who talks about how a creative life, the bar should be set at steady excellence. And I thought, oh, that's just great. I would love that. I would love to shoot for that, even though I know I would miss most of the time. I would love to have that standard for myself. But I found that was impossible. And, when people said, well, people have asked me often, what do you do when you run out of ideas? What do you do when you have writer's block? And I would always just thank them for not noticing, because it was never an option.
Yeah, that's true.
It was never an option. I had to come up with something. And so, I wish I could rewrite the first 10 years of my work and maybe re-edit the first 20 years because there was never time to get it quite right. Now, in recent years, I was working in television and it just became just too much to do both. So I stepped back from the daily strip and I only do the Sunday now. And I don't know whether readers have noticed it, but I've had time to revise, to let something just sit on my drawing board for a few days and to kind of burnish it or just reconceive the basic mechanics of it. And that's a real luxury. And at least I'm a lot happier with the work I've done the last 6 years because when I send something now, I feel satisfied. It's close to being a best effort.
Nice. I don't know about you. I get most of my best ideas for word puzzles in bed at night. I lie there, I put constraints on myself, and I combine constraints, and often something new will come out of that. And if I come up with a deadline, then there's always elements of past things I've done that I can just put a new twist on and call it a new puzzle. Yeah,
you're talking about sitting in bed with a pad and actually before you retire, you're actually writing down your.
No, I'm talking about lying in bed in the dark.
In the dark.
And coming up with an idea and imprinting it in my mind so that when I wake up in the morning, that idea is still there. I hope my idea is still there.
I do something a little bit different, which is my wife describes it as the elves' way of working, that I cut out lots of little pieces of leather before I go to bed. Now that could take the form of reading, could take the form of writing notes. It could be watching something, on television, and then going to bed, letting the right brain talk to the left brain as it does at night, exchanging, messages back and forth. And you wake up in the morning, and the elves, if they've been doing their job, well, there'll be a little pair of shoes there by your bedside, and I hop into the shower, and that's where I get my best ideas. I've gotten, it only happened once, but I got all 6 daily strips written in one shower.
Wow.
Yeah, no, that was I jumped out dripping wet and started writing down a notepad. But yeah, it's the morning, and I think that's not uncommon for writers in general. Just virtually every writer I know works best early in the morning. After their brain is rested and has had a time to, go back and forth between different sections of your brain. That's especially important with humor, because humor is the art of the incongruous. You're bringing together disparate things. The idea with humor always at the end is the surprise, and it's the surprise that makes it humorous, that makes it funny, because the reader doesn't see it coming. I don't write jokes per se. I really don't know how. My humor just comes from people being themselves. And if you look at a typical strip, it's more like dropping into a conversation, and it's more like a 4-panel smile of recognition than it is, here's the punchline and here's the rim shot. And sometimes I'll do that to emphasize that. Often I will put in a coda, so as if to say this conversation continues. This wasn't just a setup so that you got bang your little joke at the end. I learned all of that, I feel, from Robert Altman in his early movies, and I worked with him later. But when I was a college student, I saw a sneak preview of MASH, one of his early masterpieces. And I noticed that, well, first of all the characters were talking over one another. And I said, this is the first director who's had the courage to actually depict how people actually talk. They don't wait for the other person to finish talking before they start thinking of what their response is going to be. And there's all this crosstalk. So that was a real revelation to me. Just in that it was a much more truthful way of depicting how people actually communicate. But beyond that, I saw that all the humor was coming out of just, whether it's the Colonel or Radar or Hawkeye, them just kind of being themselves. Once the show became a sitcom, it fell back more into the traditional of joke telling. The structure of sitcoms in the late 70s was, was closer to that. But there were a lot of early influences that helped me find a voice, and his was the most important, I think.
Yeah. What advice? Do you have any advice for people for creativity?
Well, the piece of advice I would extend is I'm not entitled to, but I will, which is revise, revise, revise. I sound like a hypocrite because I chose a profession in which first drafts were the norm, but and I don't have a lot of patience for you know, for revising myself. But I just think it's so important if you have that opportunity to just set it aside, and no matter what the endeavor, and come back to it later. You're going to find mistakes that you just can't. You know, it's like I do the spelling bee in your newspaper.
How about that?
Yeah.
You're talking with the inventor of spelling bee.
The inventor of spelling bee. Well, one of the things that I've noticed about spelling bee is if you set it aside and then you come back to it a few hours
Isn't that amazing? It's a word can jump out at you that you didn't see, that you would.
And part of that is because you've changed the positions of the letters, right?
Yeah,
I mean, over the course of the day, they will change. And so suddenly you see you see whole words that I can sometimes glance at it and a word will rush at me. So I think that's true of any creative project, that if you take your eyes away from it and then you bring them back, you're going to, oh, how could I have done that? I mean, or here's something that's so much better. So yeah, if the work you have lends itself to that, to revisiting it, that's the most important thing you can do for yourself, I think.
Yeah, good. Do you test your comic strips and other works on others before they're released into the world? Because I certainly do with puzzles. Everything is tested. Anything I do on National Public Radio, I test on other people. First of all, to see if anything is wrong, of course, but see if it confuses anyone, and just to sharpen the puzzle before it goes out.
Well, my work has always been edited. I mean, it always has to go to an editor, but it's mostly being lawyered.
That's funny.
Initially, it was edited, but it was edited thematically. My brilliant editor, Jim Andrews, who died much too young, but not before he had edited me for 10 years, was mostly concerned with the tone of the strip. And he would say, for instance, say I was writing about the Vietnam War, as I was early on, he would say, I got no problem with you writing about a tough subject like that. I will defend that. But the next week, you damn well better write about football. In other words, he was saying, if we're going to stress the editors, the clients, and maybe some readers, give them a chance to breathe. You know, create a rhythm in the strip so that you're not just always coming at people with your high beams, you know, week after week after week. So that was important advice for somebody who wanted to be in the game long term. I sometimes would run them by my wife just to see if I could delight her, not to see if she would say, you better not do that, or you better do that over. But for the most part, no, there was never time to really get feedback. You know, that gets back to, you know, just the rush nature of the work.
Yeah, I have a friend who collects comic strips that have spelling errors. It reminded me.
Artists are terrible. Just generally speaking, are terrible spellers. I mean, yeah. If I mean, they should have just an editor that does nothing but look at for spelling errors in the comic strips. They have 200 strips to edit every week. So, you know.
Yeah.
Somebody's got it.
All right. I wanted to ask you one more thing. I have enjoyed working with your son, Ross, as a contributor to the New York Times crossword. Where do you think his interest in words and crosswords came from? And do you think it came at all from you?
It seemed self-generated in the sense that we really weren't a crossword puzzle family. I don't recall any of us doing it more than occasionally. But Ross always had a deep interest in words. He was a collector of words, and he was very brave about them. He would come up with a new word. You know, I'm talking about like when he was 6 or 7 or 8, and he would drop it during dinner, and Jane and I would look at each other. Like, A, where did that word come from? But B, he's using it in a rather strange way. And he would know that. He would say, he was testing us, and he would say, Dad, did I use that correctly?
Wow.
You know, and because it was a brand new word, and he wanted to master it, and he wanted to make sure that he was using it correctly. And so, yeah, he's always had that. And I've always collected words. Ross didn't know this. In fact, I have this running list of words, and he only found out about this a couple of years ago. And he said, "You were holding out on me." He said, "This is such a resource for," and I said, "Yeah, I guess if I thought about it, you know, as a constructor, you would find this, you know," he said, "it's a treasure trove." And because I collect jargon, and when I use jargon in the strip, the challenge is to use it in such a way not to, like so many movies do, they'll throw in jargon just to kind of impress you that they know what that world's about. That's not why I do it. I do it, yes, to create a sense of verisimilitude, but if the way I use it doesn't make the meaning very clear right away, that's a big problem for me. Right. I cannot afford to put little speed bumps into something that only takes 10 seconds to read.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I use a lot of jargon, but I always make it a priority to use it in such a way that it's instantly clear what it means. But I sent him this list recently, and there are different categories. Just give you a taste of it, right? Because I knew that you'd be interested in words. I pulled up the list. All right, so this top category, not surprisingly, is political. All right, so this is what I sent Ross. And so under political is exit ramp, wait for it, contours, jump ball, kill shot, hinge of history, theory of the case, brought receipts, push back on, not a good look for, priced into their expectations, hot take, box them out, ribbon. So, you know, that kind of stuff, my ear picks up. And then if I can put it into, if it's two politicians talking or they're being discussed on TV, I try to work that in, because some of them are quite beautiful. Some of these phrases are kind of elegant, and they lead you to the meaning quite nicely. So I don't want to ignore them. And of course, I have to update it all the time. You know, I've got a whole list under hipster. And you know that you have to update that every year, every 6 months, because certain phrases will fall out of favor, and that will betray you as a hipster wannabe.
Yeah.
And so then I have to figure, well, I have kicked characters who are hipster wannabes, so maybe, you know, being a few words late, is not such a bad thing. But anyway. I've collected these words, and I also collect words that just fall on my ear nicely, that, you know, I just like because they're so silly, or like whirligig, Lollapalooza, bumfuzzle, zip tag, tintinabulation. That's my favorite word in the world, because it has such a glorious meaning.
Yeah,
it's an explosion of bells ringing. You know, you just hear them. So. Yeah, it's helpful to me in my profession to collect words and jargon and phrases, and they, you know, there's some delight to be found in using just the right one. I mean, what was it that Twain said? The difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between the lightning bug and lightning.
Good.
And you know, with writing a comic strip, it's a distilling process. I've only got a certain number of words to work with, so I'm constantly trying to carve off words, and the secret to that is finding the right noun and finding the right verb. If the strip is cluttered up with adjectives and adverbs, that's because I have the wrong noun. I have the wrong verb.
Yeah. Well, now I understand where Ross. I understand Ross a little better. So we've run out of time. I just want to thank you again for doing this. It's been a real pleasure talking with you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I wish we could have done this in front of the people of Play. That sounds like a fun gathering.
Another time. It was a real pleasure. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks, Will.
All right. So long.